And let's go live on YouTube. Alrighty, everyone. Welcome. Good Yom Tov tonight to Kislev, going into the 20th of Kislev. And we're learning here our class in Gemara Megillah. So we're still on the first page. Hopefully we'll make a little progress today. And we're kind of a little bit in the middle of something. So I'm just going to quickly go back a drop. It says like this. Okay, the Gemara says like this. So we're on page 2a. So we're learning about the laws of the person who could hold on, I think someone's trying to get in. Sorry, can't see them. Learning about the laws of the villages that don't have minyanim, and if they could also daven. If they could also daven hear Megillah earlier, the 11th, 12th, and 13th. So that's what our Mishnah says, that they can. So Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan, Rabba the son of Bar Chana, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that this is Zu Divrei, this is the opinion only of Rabbi Akiva. Meaning to say it's not the regular opinion of the rabbis, and which is stimsa, which is a kind of a silent, doesn't say Rabbi Akiva's name in the Mishnah, but this is a silent opinion of Rabbi Akiva, as we explained the Rashi, because all the rabbis, all the students of the Mishnah are really students of Rabbi Akiva. The Darish Zmanim Zmaneim, that he uses the three levels of, it says Manehem in their plural, and because it could have said, I don't know what's going on over here. Why can't I let people in? Hold on. This is not working. Hold on. Are you able to see me, Aaron? Okay, so it says Zman, Zmanim, Zmanehem, and therefore from there we learn that it so the 11th, 12th, and 13th day, like we learned in the previous class.
Excuse me, you asked me, can I see?
Rabbis say, Ein karnois el bezmana. No, that there's only the 14th and the 15th. There's no such thing as the villagers get an earlier time to read, which is helping the villagers so they could come in on an easier time when they would come into the larger cities to study, to go to the court, so therefore they could also hear the Megillah. So Rabbi bar bar Chanan's name, Rabbi Yochanan, says this is not the common opinion. It's only the individual opinion of Rabbi Akiva. We won't learn the Rashis or Rabbi Steinsaltz. We did that last week. So Meisface, we had a question based on the ruling of Rabbi Yochanan that says that hold on, Aaron. Oh, I can see you great. Okay, thank you. That says that ask a question on this ruling of Rabbi Yochanan. Meisvei, Rabbi Yehuda says in the Brisa, Masai, when do we allow for this provision, so to say, for the 11th, 12th, and 13th to be a time for people to for the people of the villages to come in? Vizman chashanim kisiknon, in its when things were in an orderly way. Yisrael shuriyim al admasan, and the Jewish people were on their land, meaning to say in the time of the temple. Avazmanas are nowadays where things are more chaotic. Hayom mistaklin ba, because people use Purim as a way to know when Pesach is, meaning to say we don't have the system of the calendar that would allow for, so not the calendar, but so to say that the courts didn't have the system of sending messengers out to the diaspora or the other cities to let them know when the new month is, so that when the holiday is. So people had to use other methods to know when, this is according to Rashi, to know when Pesach is. So if we're going to allow people to read 11th, 12th, and 13th, and people just see that the Megillah was read on the 11th, they may count 30 days from then till Pesach, and then they're taking in Pesach a few days earlier, and then they take out Pesach a few days earlier, because Pesach is only 7 days, and then they end up eating Chametz, which is the Araisa, and Kares 3 days early. It means they're eating Chametz on Pesach because they're miscalculating the times, because this was chaotic times. After the destruction of the temple, there wasn't an organized system yet. They didn't have the calendar yet. So therefore they felt it's too dangerous. So to say, to have people do 11th, 12th, and 13th because of how people will misunderstand the timing of a Pesach. So therefore, ein kar noisel bismana, therefore, better only read it in its times. Although even its times are 14 and 15, but the 14 and 15 is more clear. But here we're talking about just people that are coming from villages, going into larger cities, has nothing, it's not walled cities, and there they can make the mistake thinking that the 14th is the 11th, and then they would miscalculate the calendar time. That's according to Rashi. Others say that there's the concern is that I think it was the Rosh, I forget who says that says that the concern was it the Rosh or someone else who said the concern was that they would it was dangerous. It was a sakana. It was partially because for the Jewish people to have a holiday and it was in Galus in the times of diaspora amongst the nations was itself a difficult thing to do. So if we're going to expand it to a longer holiday, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 5 days, so then it's dangerous. And therefore, it was endangering the Jews by making this longer holiday, and therefore they narrowed it down to 2 days, to its original 2 days, not allowing, so to say, the earlier time for the villages. Now, others say, again, there's two other reasons that are brought down, the Rosh and others. Again, there's a lot of halachas here that we're going to learn about that the rabbis spend a lot of time in the Talmud. It's kind of a little more fast, but in the halacha it kind of gets more attention because it's mamish a halacha l'maisa. It's a question about what's the law. So the Rosh and others say there's another problem. The problem is for the poor people. One problem is that the poor people, if they're going to get money, because you give the monies for the poor the same time. So there's 4 mitzvahs of Purim, right? The Megillah, to listen to the Megillah, to give gifts to the poor, the meal, and the gifts that we send of meals, known as the Mashalach Manos. We send to our friends 2 foods that they should eat, which is kind of connected to the meal. In the event that we have a separate time, for instance, in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, if it's a 3-day Purim, meaning the 15th, again, Jerusalem is a walled city. So then the 15th, could fall out on a Shabbos. You can't do a lot of the things on Shabbos. You don't do the Megillah. So then we do earlier. We learned in the Mishnah. We go earlier for the Megillah. We do Thursday night, Friday, and then you're supposed to give the gifts to the poor, and then we only eat the meals and the gifts to the meal gifts, so to say, Mashach Manas, we do on Sunday. Now, what happens if the poor get the money a few days earlier? Everyone has to eat the Suda on the 14th or the 15th. You don't eat the Suda 11th, 12th, and 13th. Even if you could hear the Megillah early, like on Shabbos, if the Shabbos is the 15th, we hear the Megillah early and we eat the meal on Sunday. So too, if you hear the Megillah on the 11th, you still have to celebrate the festivities of Purim on its proper time wherever you live. If you live in a walled city, if you live in a non-walled city, which is 14. So one opinion is that if you're going to gift the poor people too early, which is an interesting halacha, that the Rosh says the concern is that the poor people unfortunately need the money now, and they may use it now, and then when it comes time for the meal, they have already spent their money because they were gifted their gifts a few days early, and there's nothing left. So therefore, they're back to square one. They don't have money to celebrate the Chag, the holiday. So that's one concern. Imagine that the concern is that unfortunately there's going to be some people that are so poor that if they give them money now, they're going to spend it now. They're going to buy food now for their family. And then when it comes to the time of the Yom Tov, they're not going to have money to spend. So therefore the rabbis took away the idea of the early reading for the villages. Another opinion is on the contrary, something different, also connected to the poor people. That the concern is that the poor people, not knowing where's what, they're going to be chasing the Megillah readings. Meaning to say, there's going to be Megillah readings that are they're going to go to one city thinking they're reading the Megillah, and really they read the Megillah then on the 11th. Then they're going to go to another city and it's the 12th. They're going to keep on missing the Megillah reading, and then they're going to miss the gifts. So in order to organize and centralize the reading, so the poor people don't make that mistake and they don't end up running around looking for the gifts and they don't get them. So therefore, we narrowed it down to its original 2 days. Okay, that's the 2 opinions of the rabbis. The Rashba brings it down, and the Rosh brings it down of why, unlike Rashi, who says it's connected to the misunderstanding of Pesach, over there it's a misunderstanding for the poor people that either they're going to spend the money too early, or they're going to not know when the right Megillah reading is and get lost. Okay, we're not going to do the Rashis. We did this last time. So therefore he says, Rabbi Yehuda says, this is only the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So therefore we don't read the Megillah early. Now the Gemara asks a question on this Rabbi Yehuda statement. Rabbi Yehuda liba deman. Who does Rabbi Yehuda hold like? This I think we're holding. If you want to say Rabbi Yehuda says that the idea of the villages reading early was only things kitikunon, meaning in the time of the second temple or in times when things were organized. Tikkun means organized. So, and then afterwards they took it away back to its only to the 14th and the 15th, which incidentally is the law today. Is Alibid Rabbi Kiva, Ilem Alibid Rabbi Kiva, he's talking towards Rabbi Kiva, Afilu Bizman Hazai Isa Lahaitakanta. Rabbi Kiva himself lived after in the time of the diaspora, after the destruction. He only died in the uprising of Bar Kokhba, so that he instituted it initially to only be in the time of the diaspora. So how could you say that things changed? So obviously Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. It means Rabbi Yochanan says that our mission that says that there's that we allow for the reading of 11, 12, 13 for the villages to come in is only the opinion of Rabbi Kiva, but the rabbis don't agree to that. Then Rabbi Yehuda says that this same 11, 12, 13 is only in the times of the temple. And Rabbi Kiva only instituted it after the temple. So obviously, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of you can't say that Rabbi Yehuda is talking the opinion of Rabbi Kiva. It means he's talking the opinion of someone else. It means there's another opinion, which is the rabbis, seemingly. But then that doesn't make sense because Rabbi Yochanan says the rabbis don't agree with the whole statement at all. Okay, so therefore it can't be Rabbi Yehuda holds according to Rabbi Kiva, based on what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Now, what does it mean that Rabbi Akiva lived in the time of the diaspora? So Rashi says, like we learned, that the Rabbi Akiva is manazeh, v'amar masnis in the makdimim. Rabbi Akiva lived in the time after the temple. Now, obviously, the commentaries ask that that's not accurate. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva lived before. His father-in-law was Kabba Savua, but he lived very long. He lived, I believe, 120 years. But again, like we said last week, that he started his life as Rabbi Akiva, giving guidance when he started learning Torah very late. He only started to learn Torah at 40, and then he studied 24 years. So therefore, by the time he gave different rulings and teachings, he was already ahead in his age, and he was already in his late 60s or 70s, and by that time, the temple was already destroyed. Okay, this is, I think, we're holding. Elalav, so the Gemara says, so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda, who says that we've changed from temple times to after temple times, is according to the rabbis. Because Rabbi Akiva himself only instituted it in the time of the temple, if you're saying that the mission is Rabbi Akiva. And in the time when the temple is standing and things are orderly, whatever the concern is, Rashi, Pesach, or the poor people, so then people know more better. Yisrael, Shurna, Adbasim, the Jewish people are on their land. Miyakarinim, but we do read on 11, 12, and 13. And Rabbi Yochanan says the rabbis don't agree with the ruling at all. So how does this make sense? So the Gemara answers Tiyufta Rabbi Yochanan Tiyufta. Therefore, what Rabbi Yochanan says has been refuted, and it's not. We don't agree with that. So meaning to say, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that according to this opinion of the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva would hold that there's the reading even after. If you're going to say, okay, if you're refuting Rabbi Yochanan, you have to refute that it's Rabbi Akiva at all. So then you just say it's the one opinion of the rabbis, and the rabbis said we read 11, 12, 13. Everyone agrees with that. The question is, when do we continue with this ruling only as long as the temple is standing and the Jewish people are on their land? Let's just go with Rashi so we know everyone knows the dates don't mean Pesach is starting 3 days earlier, etc. And information is flowing properly. And everyone agrees to that. But when the temple was destroyed and there was concern that the allowance for the villages to read earlier could cause complications, whatever those complications are according to different opinions. Therefore, no longer do we have that ruling, which again, incidentally, is the ruling today. There is no such concept as reading 11, 12, and 13 for the villagers. Okay, so then, therefore, the Rabbi Yochanan statement doesn't hold water, and Rabbi Yehuda is just explaining the statement of the Mishnah. So, Elalav, Alibid Rabbanan, Dahavim Mekami Rabbi Kivamra. So if you want to say that Rabbi Akiva is saying separately from the rabbis, that means the rabbis that are before Rabbi Akiva said that there's a difference between temple times and after temple times. But they do read in the times of the temple. and therefore we say Tiyufta Rabbi Yochanan. Again, meaning to say that if you're going to refute Rabbi Yochanan, you're going to say either one or two things: that there's still Rabbi Akiva's opinion, but Rabbi Akiva's opinion is agreeing with the rabbis, just extending the time even after the destruction of the temple, or the whole statement of Rabbi Yochanan is refuted, and the mission is not according to Rabbi Akiva, it's according to the rabbis, and the rabbis instituted it only according to Rabbi Yehuda, only in the time of the temples, but after the time of the temples, for the various concerns that could happen, the Jewish people only read the Megillah on the 14th and the 15th. Okay, so that's the first understanding of the Gemara. Okay, so the Gemara says, okay, Ikadamri. There's another way of learning this statement in the Talmud, which is like this: Amar Rabba bar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabba bar Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba, the son of Barchana, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Zu Divrei Rabbi Kiva Stimsa'a, that our Mishnah is according to Rabbi Kiva, which is an unnamed Mishnah, that is to say that there's a concept of 11, 12, 13 for the villagers. And Rabbi Kiva again lived after the destruction of the temple. I mean, he, so to say, ruled after the destruction of the temple as a Rosh Hashiva, as a student, as a teacher. And therefore, that statement was including even nowadays. But the rabbis say, that we don't no longer allow for this 11, 12, 13 to be read for the villagers in today's day, meaning after the destruction and things were kind of out of control. So therefore, because people may misread the calendar, or the poor people may come to the wrong place, or according to the opinions that it may be dangerous to have a long holiday, we no longer extend it to 11, 12, 13th. We only have 14th and 15th. Now, the question obviously is, halachically, today, where some of these concerns are no longer there, i.e., we have a calendar, so everyone knows when Pesach is. No one's looking today at Purim to know when Pesach is. You open up your calendar, open up your website, and you know clearly when Pesach is. So according to Rashi, the concern of miscalculating Pesach is no longer a concern. Or according to even the poor people, they would know where to, they could calculate better. Some of the other concerns are maybe still there. So why wouldn't we have reinstated the idea of 11, 12, 13? But that we could say because we wouldn't reinstate something once the rabbis said it's off. So Ikeda Amri, the others, Rashi says, others who say that Amar Rabba, Zu Divri Rabbi Kiva Stimsa, Leger Sinan Hailishna, the Darsh Zman Zmanus Maneim. Then you don't say that Rabbi Kiva is the only one who learns it from the three plurals of time, times, and times, plural, multiple times. The Haraban and the Polig Leinamidar states, not that Rabbi Kiva only learns it, both agree. But the rabbis kind of got concerned for after temple times, after the destruction, that things may go wrong, and then it's going to cause complications, and therefore they took off. They no longer allowed for 11, 12, and 13. Okay, let's see what Rabbi Steinsaltz says over here, Rabbi Evan Yisrael. According to some, the concern is that people may come to set the date of Passover according to the date on which the Megillah is read, which is what we learned about Rashi and the Reed, Tosafos Reed. Others explain that the poor look to the time when the Megillah is read and expect to receive Purim gifts for the needy, right? At the same time, they may become distraught if the Megillah is read and the gifts are not distributed, because either they're not going to distribute the gifts or because they're going to be in the wrong place. Rabbeinu Ephraim explains in similar fashion, if the money is distributed when the Megillah is read in advance of the holiday, the poor might come to squander it and not have any money left with which to celebrate Purim itself. So it's going to be counted, which is interesting halacha. If you think about it, the law, what the Torah is saying over there, the Torah is basically saying that even though tzedakah is tzedakah, and if the poor person needs it now, it means the poor person's hungry. So what are we basically saying? We're saying is don't read the Megillah early, because people are going to give gifts to the poor like you're supposed to do on 11th. And the poor person, unfortunately, because of their dire situation and their kids are hungry, they're going to have to feed them now. So they're going to spend the money now, and they're not going to have money for Purim Suda. But the kids are hungry now. I mean, the Torah is basically saying, this is why you have to be mistaklim by rice. You have to look into Torah. The Torah is basically saying, Don't read the Megillah early because they may spend the money now. Not because they're going to spend the money now on things they shouldn't be spending on. They're going to spend the money now on things on necessities. The kids need to eat. The family needs to eat. But at the end of the day, they're not going to have money for Purim. So therefore, the rabbis uprooted the idea of having an early reading, even though you could argue the opposite. Maybe by spreading it out, helps the poor people have more money a longer amount of time. You have today people that would travel, they'll be in Jerusalem. Those who are collecting will be in Jerusalem on the 15th and be outside of Jerusalem on the 14th. So they could collect 2 days. But evidently, according to the other opinions, they didn't hold of that. Reb Hai Gaon, like we mentioned last week about Reb Hai Gaon, version of the text reads mistakenim, from the word sakana. They are endangered themselves. He explains that nowadays when the Jews are subject to persecution, it's better not to add the days of Purim, meaning, Purim in general is a holiday when the Jewish people are celebrating. What are we celebrating? We're celebrating our victory over the nations, and not just isolated to Egypt like Pesach. That all the nations, the Achashverosh ruled the whole world. That all the nations, right? This is basically the holiday where the Jew celebrates over the anti-Semite. Pesach is not about anti-Semitism. It's about that Passover, the enslavement of Pharaoh, and the whole story we're learning now in the Torah with Egypt. But to be honest, the story of Purim is the story of celebration over the anti-Semite. And it's not really a great holiday to have if we're still at risk of the anti-Semite. And therefore, Rabbi Hai Gaon, again, those who listen to Rabbi Steinsaltz's story on Rabbi Hai, his father was killed. His father, the Gaon, was killed by the government. So he was sensitive to anti-Semitism. And therefore, he says, better not have it for so many days. And he explains that nowadays that the Jews are subject to persecution, it's better not to add the days of Purim, and it's not to intensify the danger. This is also indicated in the Jerusalem Talmud. Again, one could argue, means even if we have a 5-day Purim, Pesach is 7 days, Sukkot is 7, 8 days, right? So it's not like the idea of Chanukah, which is also a celebration over the Greeks, is 8 days. Why are we so careful about Purim, that we don't make it more than, first of all, you could say Hanukkah has to be 8 days. That's the whole holiday. And Pesach has to be 8 days, 7, 8 days. And Sukkot has to be 7, 8 days. But in a case where we're expanding it because of the concern of the villages, we won't add. But also you could say that, again, Purim is the holiday really that's in the face of the nations, more even than Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the idea of light. Purim is literally a celebration against the Haman who wanted to destroy the Jewish people. And therefore, maybe the Reb Hai Gaon felt, 2 days is enough. Tani Nami Hach, we also learned. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Emasai, we also learned like this. That Rabbi Yehuda says, Emasai, when do we have the laws of 11, 12, and 13? This man Shashanim Kisikna Vishral Shrimad Masim. Al-Azman is there, how you mustakim by Inkarim Oisa El Bezmana. And today we learned also that he's saying Emasai, when do we when is this ruling of 11, 12, and 13? Only as long as the Jewish people are on the lands. But today, because everyone is made looking at the calendar, we don't read it only in this time. Hold on a second. Okay. Now Rav Ashi says like this. Rav Ashi kashleit Rabbi Yehuda. That Rabbi Ashi has a question on 2 versions of Rabbi Yehuda. Meaning, Rashi says, Kashi Rabbi Yehuda the Ha Braisa from our Braisa, the Leal that we mentioned, Ad Rabbi Yehuda the Masnisin can the Farsh Vazil, as according to another statement of Rabbi Yehuda at a Mishnah, which is said as it will be explained. Let's turn the page. We're holding a now 2b. And because of this question that he's going to be challenged, so he now says that this that we learned before, that Rabbi Yehuda says that today's days we don't no longer have 11, 12, and 13. That's no longer the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. It's the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. So it's another person saying this, and we'll see why. And he keeps the Mishnah that we're going to quote as Rabbi Yehuda, and the Braisa that we just learned as Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda. So this to say, as is not a contradiction in what Rabbi Yehuda says. What's this contradiction? So the Gemara says, is there such a statement that Rabbi Yehuda says that because people are looking at the date of Pesach, of Purim, they made it saying, according to Rashi, confused Pesach, and therefore we only read on the 14th and 15th. We no longer read on the 11th, 12th, and 13th. For Amina, we have a question. That Rabbi Yehuda, we have a Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, Masai, when do we read 11, 12, and 13? As long as the people gather for courts on Mondays and Thursdays. But in places where they're not coming into the villages, to the cities on Mondays and Thursdays for court cases, and we only read it in its right time. So what do we see from here? Let's see Rashi. The only time we have this allocation, 11, 12, 13, is when the people from the villages come into a city that has a set court that would sit in session on a Monday and Thursdays, and therefore they would come into the cities on a Mondays and Thursdays. But the places that you don't come in on Mondays and Thursdays, then you're actually not making life easier for the villages. Means if the villages are coming in on a Monday and a Thursday because they come in for, like we learned before, for the courts, etc., for things they have to do in the big city, so then you're helping them by allowing them to read on 11, 12, 13. But if they're not coming in on Monday and Thursday, why would you? It's not helping anyone. So here he says like this. Rabbi Steinsaltz says, we'll get to the question in a second, to the contradiction in a second. Basically, the Gemara is saying, what do we see from here? That Rabbi Yehuda's concern is only if they come in on Mondays and Thursdays. If they come in on Mondays and Thursdays, then we read 11, 12, 13. If they don't come in on Mondays and Thursdays, then they don't read on 11, 12, 13. But if they do come in on Mondays and Thursdays, they do read. And he doesn't say anything about before the temple or after the temple. So the very fact that he doesn't make a distinction between before and after the temple means that he holds even nowadays we sit, as long as they gather on Mondays and Thursdays, they read the Megillah early. So how could Rabbi Yehuda say that it's only talking about in temple times, not after temple times? It's obviously a contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, the Gemara says it's not a contradiction. The first statement is not Rabbi Yehuda, it's someone else. It's Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. So that's one statement that says that it's only in temple times, not nowadays. And a separate statement from Rabbi Yehuda says it's all about if they come in on Mondays and Thursdays. If they come in on Mondays and Thursdays, even after the destruction, they would read 11, 12, and 13. Okay, that's how the Gemara is going to answer this contradiction. But let's see what Rabbi Evan Yisrael says over here. The Rabbi says, Rabbi Steinsaltz says like this. The provision was enacted on behalf of those villagers who generally go to town on Mondays and Thursdays in order to allow them to advance their reading of the Megillah to the day of assembly that they go in anyways. They come to the Mondays and Thursdays because they're in the cities anyways on Mondays and Thursdays. However, because for court cases, etc. However, in a place where they do not generally go to the town on Mondays and Thursdays, no such enactment was made in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, following the principle that whenever he says, when he comes to explain the opinion of the sages, I think he quotes the Rambam Sefer Zmanim. I have to see the Rambam, but basically, Rabbi Yehuda, who's explaining, says basically he's just explaining what the Mishnah says. It's only as long as there's a reason to be there for Monday and Thursday. But if there's no reason to be in the city for Monday and Thursday, then you don't have an early reading. Okay, but that's the opinion of Rabbi Kiva in the Mishnah. But the Gemara continues in the question. But if they do gather on Mondays and Thursdays, then we do read. Even after the temple is destroyed. Therefore, we say that the Brisa that says that there's a difference between the destruction, pre-destruction, and after destruction is actually not the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. So therefore, there's no complication. So if we stop right here, we have a Mishnah that says just a general statement. That there's 5 times you read. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 11, 12, and 13th are for the villagers. 14th are for the cities that are unwalled. And 15th are for the cities of walled. We had Rabbi Yochanan that says that that's only the isolated opinion of Rabbi Akiva, not the rabbis. We said that's not the case because the rabbis also agree to to the reading. The difference is only based on Rabbi Yehuda that the rabbis say it's only in temple times, because after the destruction of the temple, no longer, for the many reasons why, we no longer read on 11, 12, and 13. So then the Gemara says that is Rav Ashi explains it's not actually the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. Then we have a second opinion, which is in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, which says that's only talking about Mondays and Thursdays when they gather on Mondays and Thursdays. But if they wouldn't gather on Mondays and Thursdays, then there's no longer reason for 11, 12, and 13. If we remain with this statement right here, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, we should still read on 11, 12, and 13, which means has nothing to do with temple time. So basically, we have Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says it's only during temple times, post-temple times no longer. We have Rabbi Yehuda that says it's post-temple times as well, as long as they gather Mondays and Thursdays. So if we had to know the law today, we would say there's different opinions. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Just because you have a contradiction, he decided to just easily say that this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi by Yehuda, and we change the names. I mean, that's when you have a question. That's how you deal with a question. Just to say, well, sorry, it's a printing mistake. It's the wrong name. It's not Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, and that answers the question. That's not a way to learn Torah. Mishum dekashle bitmir. The Gemara Rashi says this is your solution to a problem. Is just to change the name of the person. So let's see what Reb Steinsaltz says. Rabbi Even Yisrael. The Rashba and the Ritva explain that the Gemara's objection to Rav Ashi's reformulation of the Brisa is based, means to name it on Rabbi Yossi by Yehuda instead of Rabbi Yehuda, is based on the fact that it would have been possible to resolve the contradiction in a simple way by explaining that the conflicting statements of Rabbi Yehuda were stated in accordance with the two different opinions of Rabbi Kiva and that of the sages. And there was no need to attribute the Brisa to Rabbi Yossi or Yehuda. Meaning the Ritva and Rashba say, but what do you mean the Gemara says you have to change the name? We have a contradiction. How do we work? So you could have said, no, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, according to the opinion of the rabbis, that it's only until Pesach, until as long as the temple is standing, that's according to the rabbis. This that we have Mondays and Thursdays is according to the opinion of Rabbi Kiva, where it continues. It means Rabbi Yehuda is just explaining according to the rabbis and Rabbi Kiva. He's not giving his own statement. So therefore, why do we have to change the names? Just keep the names and say, well, here's in the first case, Rabbi Yehuda is talking in the opinion of the rabbis, and in the second case, where he mentions that on Mondays and Thursdays we would read even after the temple, as long as they gather, is according to the opinion of Rabbi Kiva, who says you could read even afterwards, according to the understanding of the first opinion of the Gemara. So the Gemara answers like this: it's not just Rabbi Ashi is saying, there's a famous story. There's a famous story, I forget to say, that they came to the Rambam in heaven. They had someone, after someone passed away who was very into studying the Rambam, had all these questions. So when this person was so excited, when he got to heaven, he ran to the Rambam's chamber in Garden of Eden to present all his questions on Maimonides, on the Yad Chazaka. And he brought to the Rambam to his attention some contradictions. So the Rambam answered, it's a printing mistake. So the person says, that's how you learn the Rambam? They say it's a printing mistake. I mean, that's not the way. You have to get deep and try to figure out how it's not a contradiction. So here the Gemara is saying, that's how you learned. Rav Ashi deals with the problem, he changes the name. So he says, no, it's not just that he changed the name. Rav Ashi Shmile. Rav Ashi has a tradition. Rav Ashi was one of the final opinions of the Talmud, right? And he has an opinion that he heard a tradition. He heard that there's some people that say, you have to remember, everything was oral initially. So he heard that some people said that this was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and some people said this was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So then when he found the contradiction, that maybe the people who said initially that this was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, there was a mistake, because he had a tradition initially that wasn't clear who said this first statement. And therefore we have to say that the people who thought that this actually initial statement of the Brisa that differentiates between before and after the temple, that he heard people that said it in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, he realized that they were right. It means Rav Ashi is one of the people that organized the Talmud. And therefore, he said, oh, 1 second, there's a contradiction here. He says, oh, really? It must be that the people that were really attributing the initial statement in Rabbi Yosef Yehuda were right, and therefore it's not a contradiction. But traditionally, we don't deal with the problem that way, to just give another name. Okay. This finishes the first section of the Gemara. Now we continue. Now we're going to go into the question of that the Gemara is going to go into. How do we define a walled city and at what times? So the Mishnah said that that a city had to be walled from the times of Joshua. Means when Joshua entered the land, that's when we decide. Again, we have the opinions of the Ran. Does that apply to outside of Eretz Yisrael, only inside of Eretz Yisrael? But we have the opinion that says that krachim hamukafim chayma, that our Mishnah says that what defines a walled city to read on the 15th is any city that was walled in the days of Yishru ben Nun, even if it wasn't walled now. Meaning, again, Jerusalem, that we have a city walled in the old city was only in the times of today, after the destruction of the temple, 500 years ago, the Sultan put the walls up. Before that, Jerusalem was an unwalled city. Maybe it was walled in between, but with all the wars, the Crusades, etc. The time of Purim, definitely Jerusalem was not a walled city. It was the destruction of the first temple. So therefore, we go according to how it was in the times of Joshua. And in Joshua's times, for instance, Jerusalem was walled. The question is if Shushan was walled in the days of Joshua. So we read in the 15th. So the Gemara asked the question, where do we know this from? How do we know that cities that are walled in the times of Joshua read on the 15th? Okay, before we continue, we just have to go quickly through the passages of Esther, of the Megillah. Oops, wrong one. Of Esther to see what we're talking about over here. Hopefully, okay. So in chapter 9, it's going to come up all the time, all these verses. So I might as well just bring it down now. In chapter 9, after we talk about the Achashverosh allows for the Jewish people to destroy their enemies. It says in chapter 9, verse 12, Vayomer Melech LaEsther Malka, B'Shushan Abir Harga Yehudim Va'abed Chamesh Meisish, that in the Shushan, the capital, the winter capital, the Jews killed 500 people. V'Aseres B'nei Haman and the 10 sons of Haman. B'Shar Medinas HaMelech Ma'osu. What else do you want to do? So what does Esther say? So in verse 13, Esther says, Esther, so Esther says to the king, if it's okay with the king, so give the Jews in Shushan one more day to deal with their enemies. It's not enough that we killed the 10 sons of Haman. I want them hung. Okay, so on the gallows. He lets her do that. That the Jews, Shushan, and he passes a law in the city of Shushan, in the capital. So he said that on one more day they could kill their enemies, and they hung up the 10 kids of the 10 sons of Haman. Now the Megillah says, "Vayikala Yehudim asher b'Shushan gam b'yem arba'as l'chaydesh v'hargu b'Shushan shleish meis ish u'babiza le'shalchu yadam." So what happened? That on the 14th means the initial edict was for the 13th, but on the 14th, because the king allowed, they again killed their enemies and killed an additional 300 people to make the final number at 800. Ushar Yehudim asher medinas hamech nekol v'amdu al nafsham v'noyach maveim v'harg b'soneim chamisha v'shivim elef v'biza le'shalch yadim. And then in verse 16 it says that the nations outside of Shushan, they rested on the 14th, and in total they killed 75,000 people. And therefore, they rested on the 14th because they only killed on the 13th. And so the 14th was a day of holiday and celebration. However, the Yehudim that were in Shushan, because they continued killing on the 14th, therefore they only rested on Chamisha Asar on the 15th, and then they made that day, meaning the 15th, the day of celebration. Therefore, now this applies to today. Al-Kain. So now the Megillah says, therefore, HaYehudim HaPrazim HaYoshim B'Ari HaPrazes, the Jews that live in the open cities. Oisim Misyem Arba Asa L'Chodesh Adar Simcha Mishlav Yom Tov. Therefore, the holiday of Purim, the day of celebrations on the 14th, in commemorance of what happened to all the cities outside of Shushan, that they killed on the 13th and rested on the 14th, and they should send Mishloach Manas Ish L'Reu, they should send gifts to their friends. And therefore, Vayichtav Mordechai Sadvar Meila, Mordechai wrote down in the Megillah, Vayishlach Sfarim Al Kol Yehudim, he sent a message to all the Jewish communities, Asher B'Kol Medinas Achashverosh, in all the countries and lands and cities of Achashverosh, Hakrevim V'Arachaykim, close and near and far, L'Kayim Aleim Las Liyais Oisim Esyem Arba Asa L'Chodesh Adar V'Esyem Chamisha Asa B'Chol Shana V'Shana, that they should do on the 14th and the 15th. It doesn't say what they should do on the 14th and the 15th. It just says that they should do on the 14th and the 15th. Kayam Masher Nochabem, just like the Jewish people rested. That they should do a holiday on the 14th and 15th, but doesn't say the 14th and 15th separate from walled cities, not walled cities. And the V'kibel Yehudim and the Jewish people accepted. So we have clearly that the story, what happened was Shushan killed on 13, 14, rested 15, made the 15th a holiday on that year, seemingly. The Jewish people outside of Shushan killed on the 13th, made the 14th a holiday. Then Mordechai writes to do on the 14th and the 15th as they did. Now, from this, the Gemara is going to say like this. Now the Gemara asks a question, Minani immediately, how do we know? How do we know that we celebrate also on the 15th? So, like the Gemara says like this, Amar Rava. So Rava says, based on what we just learned now in the Megillah, the Amar Kra, Al-Kena Yehudim Prazim Yeshim Bari Prazis. Clearly, the Torah, the Megillah says, therefore the cities that are open, unwalled cities, that they celebrate on the 14th. It clearly says the unwalled cities celebrate on the 14th. It just says that they should do on the 14th, 15th. It doesn't say a difference between walled cities and unwalled cities. But it did say initially in verse 19 that therefore the cities that are unwalled should keep the 14th. So therefore, therefore we know clearly that we separate, because the Megillah only says the 14th is a day of resting, and therefore the unwalled cities today celebrate the 14th. So therefore you have to assume that from the 15th, when it says therefore we do the 15th, it means to say the 15th is only connected to the cities that are connected to Shushan, that are the walled cities, because it says the unwalled cities. That means the walled cities would do on the 15th. Let's see Rashi. Rashi says, "Prazim ir she'en lachayma." What is a prazim? Prazim means cities that don't have a wall. And because they're unwalled, the cities are spread around. They're not connected. And like we had the opinions of the Mefarshim that say, therefore the vulnerability of these cities was much stronger because they were exposed to, they were unprotected, and therefore clearly they have to make a celebration. However, Mekafim, the cities that are walled, B'Tesvav, they would do on the 15th. Because although, like we said over here, that Mordechai wrote to do on the 14th and 15th, it doesn't say who does on the 14th, who does on the 15th. But it does say that this unwalled cities do on the 14th. So we have to assume that when we mentions that there's a holiday on the 15th, it's talking about the walled cities. Okay. So that's how Rav understands it. So the Gemara says like this: the Ema, that Prazim Barba Asa, that maybe only the unwalled cities do on the 14th. Mukafim Klal Loi, and the ones that are the walled cities don't celebrate Purim. Why? Like the Pnei Yeshua brings down according to the Ramban, like I said before, that Rashi quotes the Prazim, the open cities were the most vulnerable cities. The walled cities weren't vulnerable. The metropolitans were protected. It was the Jews living in the unprotected areas that were most vulnerable. Therefore, for them it was a holiday. And maybe these people live in a city don't celebrate Purim at all. It just says Purim. That nowhere in the Megillah does it say clearly that a walled city celebrates on the 15th. It just says that you celebrate on the 14th and 15th. It clearly says unwalled cities celebrate on the 14th. Rava says, therefore, the logic is if it mentions the 14th for unwalled cities, and Mordechai wrote to celebrate 14, 15, obviously the 15th is for the walled cities. But it doesn't say anywhere that the walled cities has to celebrate. So therefore the Gemara asks, maybe the walled cities don't celebrate at all. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? V'lav Yisrael ninu, are they not Jewish? I mean, this is a holiday for everyone. Also it says that he wrote to all the countries, and all the countries means from Hodu to Kush. And in the Hodu and Kush, in between that space, there's many cities that are walled. So how could you assume that the people in the walled cities should not celebrate Purim? The Rashi says this: Klal uklal loy v'chamesha asad d'chsiv Megillah shadai l'shushan kederech shenocha by b'shatz hanes. So the obvious question is, what do you mean? According to the Gemara's question, that maybe the walled cities don't celebrate, but clearly Mordechai wrote in the Megillah, as we saw before, to celebrate the 14th and 15th. Okay, clearly it says the 14th is for the unwalled cities. And doesn't say who celebrates on the 15th, but who celebrates on the 15th? If you're saying the walled cities don't celebrate. So Rashi says that would be only the city of Shushan. So we would, in the Gemara's question, we assume that there's three groups. There's unwalled cities, walled cities, and Shushan. Shushan is the only city that killed on the 14th. And therefore, the only time they rested and celebrated on the 15th was in Shushan. Why would the walled cities have this 15th? And the Megillah doesn't say anything about the walled cities. It only says unwalled cities. So actually, the question makes a lot of sense. Shushan that rested on the 15th, celebrate on the 15th today. Unwalled cities that clearly says in the Megillah, celebrate on the 14th. And a walled city that's not vulnerable, it wasn't such a miracle. They don't celebrate at Purim at all. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Are they not Jewish? They're not part of the you have to remember, if I'm not mistaken, that there were certain Jews, something I think like certain places, like the Jewish people, the community in Taiman, in the Taimani Jews, the Yemen Jews, and not they could have been included in the boundaries of Achashverosh, but they kind of were stuck in Yemen from the first temple. About their tradition of Purim is not so clear. If I'm not mistaken, maybe I'm wrong. But either way, Mehodavat Kush, but it says Hodav to Kush. Ksiv Shekiblu Aleim Purim, that all the Jews in Achashverosh's kingdom, from Hodu till Kush. There's a question we're going to learn. Where's Hodu and Kush? Hodu traditionally would be India, and Kush would be somewhere in Africa. But we're going to learn later in the Gemara that it's not clear where these places are, where Kush is, and also how you measure the distance. You could have the distance the long way or the short way. If, let's say, Hodu is here and Kush is here, you could have between here, or you could have all the way around, right? So from Hodu to Kush, Shekibla Aleim Purim, the Chsiva Yishtach Sfar Mechol Medinas Melech Achashverosh. We already established that Achashverosh was king from Hodu to Kush, which again, the areas of Hodu would be either India and Africa, and depending on which direction they go. But either way, he was the king of pretty much of the civilized world of his time. And it says he sent letters to all the people in the kingdom. The Kaimalema that everyone should keep Purim. Even though it doesn't say that he wrote from Hodu to Kush, Bahaikra on the verse, because we said he wrote to all the kingdoms of Achashverosh, and he was the king from Hodu to Kush, and then there were cities that were walled. Therefore, everyone has to keep Purim. So clearly, everyone has to keep Purim. So when do they keep? They have to keep on the 15th, because it says the 14th is only for unwalled cities, and it mentions you have to keep the 15th. So therefore, it makes sense that we would keep the 15th for the walled cities. So he says like this. Rabbi Evan Yisrael says like this. Some explain the reason I keep on going back and forth in Steinsaltz and Evan Yisrael. It's the same person. Rabbi Steinsaltz's name was initially Steinsaltz, and later in his life, the Rebbe suggested that he changes his name to Evan Yisrael. So he named his name Evan Yisrael because he was known as Rabbi Steinsaltz before then, and he already started to write the Talmud. So he's named as Steinsaltz, Evan Yisrael hyphen Steinsaltz. Okay. So some explain that this twofold answer, according to the opinion of the Ramban, who states that since the primary danger was to those living in the unwalled towns, like I said before, that because the main concern was the people that lived in the unwalled towns, they were the vulnerable ones. And especially those in Eretz Yisrael. They were especially vulnerable because I guess in Eretz Yisrael there was a lack of law. It was kind of because of the destruction, it was really uprooted. There was much more danger there was lack of law, and therefore Nehemiah, we know later, Nehemiah had to come with soldiers. It was a very lawless place. So in the times of between the destruction of the first temple and the building of the second temple, it is possible that to entertain the notion that those living in walled cities need not celebrate Purim at all because they were never endangered, based on the Ramban's understanding. The Gemara answers that first of all, they too are Jews. And as such, they too must celebrate with their brethren, even if they personally weren't in danger, but the Jewish people were in danger. Second, Haman's edict was from Hodod until Cush, and therefore also included the residents of the walled cities. Even though they were not in immediate danger, they nevertheless shared the miracle. Okay, that's the Ginzei Malaka says that that's the reason why we have two answers in the Gemara. One is they're Jewish, so they have to celebrate. And also, it's not so simple that they weren't in danger, because eventually they also would have been in danger. It's always that the question is, when there's a crisis for the Jewish people, that's someone else's crisis until it's your crisis. My grandmother always says that when she was in Hungary, Romania before the war, during the war. So when people escaped from Poland from the concentration camps and gathered the peoples in her village, in her city, to tell the Jews to run away because the Nazis were coming, they said, okay, that's happening in Poland. It would never happen here. So people don't believe it's going to happen here until it happens here. Okay, what's Hodun Kush? Rabbi Evan Yisrael says it appears that the dispute here centers on the meaning of the word kush. Okay, I'm not sure if this footnote belongs here, because we don't bring any dispute about what kush is, but we'll read anyways. The question is whether this refers to a land of Kush located in Africa, which would be south of Egypt, or the nation of the Kushite people, which arose at the time in western section of India. Western section of India. So the question is where Kush is, and Hodu is India. So Hodu to Kush then would be within India, or Hodu to Kush is India to Africa. I don't believe this footnote is in its proper place. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara continues asking the question. Again, as we read in the Megillah talks about the story and the letter that Mordechai said afterwards. And they're not really connected. The Gemara is not learning it to be absolutely connected. Again, the story is that the people outside of Shushan, anywhere outside the capital, they fought and killed their enemies on the 13th, and they all rested on the 14th. The people in Shushan, and that was only for Shushan, killed on the 13th and 14th and rested on the 15th. That's the fact. That's what happened. Based on that, Mordechai says that the cities that are unwalled celebrate on the 14th, and he sends a letter saying everyone has to celebrate on the 14th, 15th. Nowhere does the Megillah say that walled cities have to celebrate on the 15th. We know there has to be a celebration on the 15th. We're just not sure who celebrates. Like Rashi says, could be only Shushan celebrates on the 15th, as was the story. And maybe the walled cities don't celebrate. But the Gemara says, what do you mean they don't celebrate? They're Jews and they're also in danger. So therefore, but the question is still, we don't know when they celebrate. The Ema, maybe we say that present by Abrasar, clearly Mordechai writes to make that only unwalled cities celebrate on the 14th. But the walled cities would celebrate both on the 14th and the 15th. How do we know they only celebrate on the 15th? Meaning he said they have the choice to celebrate both. And that's if you read the verse. The verse says to make the 14th and the 15th a holiday. Maybe that verse is referring to the walled cities, that they celebrate the 14th and the 15th. Because again, there's nowhere that it says it's only the 15th for walled cities. So Rashi says this. This is still part of the question. Because it says that they do, meaning maybe they do only both the 14th and the 15th. That maybe the open cities, unwalled cities, celebrate the 14th. Clearly the pasuk says, the verse says in Esther that Mordechai says that the unwalled cities do the 14th. That says clearly. But because the walled cities, we have no indication when they celebrate. There's no pasuk that tells us that they have to specifically only celebrate on the 15th. Maybe they have a choice. They could either read on the 14th or on the 15th. Meaning to say that the Megillah clearly says unwalled cities is only the 14th. Maybe when Mordechai writes to keep the 14th, 15 means that walled cities have a choice. Okay, this Rashi again is out of its place. We'll have to go back to this Rashi in a second. So the Gemara answers like this. have a kosiv es yoim arba aser v'chamisha aser kitakamart. If it says in the verse that they make, again, the verse says like this, verse 21, l'kayim aleim oisim esrim arba aser l'chodesh v'es yoim chamisha aser. It says to make the 14th, and then it says v'es and the 15th. If it would say esrim arba aser v'chamisha aser, that would make sense. Then they have a choice. But the fact he says, if it would say Esrim Arba Asar V'chamisha Asar without the word S in between, then you could say that they have a choice to do the 14th or the 15th. Ahashta, however, because the actual wording of the pasuk is Esrim Arba Asar V'Esrim Chamisha Asar, there's the word S. Every word in the Torah is exact. So why does it have to say V'Es another time? Asa S pasuk, it's coming to separate either the 14th or the 15th. Not that you have a choice to do 14th or 15th, up to you. Means there's some people that do only the 14th and some people that do only the 15th. Means some people do the 14th and some people only do the 15th. Not that you have a choice to do either the 14th or the 15th. Okay, there's one shiloh over here. It says over here like this. There is a place in the Gemara that says. Es Yad V'Sraglav, there's a time not every S is separate, but depending on, again, there's a lot of halachas that bring down over here, but basically, the tradition is that whenever it says S and in middle, and it doesn't have to, it's not coming to combined, it's coming to separate. That's the rule. If the S is, if it's not so simple, means if the simple reading would be 14th or 15th, then you could choose between 14th and 15th. So you'd ask, why does the Torah say again S? It should say 14th or 15th. The fact that it says and the 14th and the 15th is coming to separate. So as long as the flow doesn't make sense, so the extra S, the rule is it's coming to separate, meaning or the 14th or the 15th. You can't do both. But you still don't know when the walled cities do, because it doesn't say. So the Gemara asks, Eimer Prazim Barbasar. Meaning to say, yes, they can't celebrate both, but they could choose which one. But again, the verse says in their proper times. Means the time of one is not the time of the other. If the walled cities have a separate time, it's only that time, not either times. Okay, so therefore we say that it's only the 14th or the 15th, and the 14th is for the unwalled cities, and the 15th is for the walled cities. But the Gemara asks one more question, 1 second. So maybe, let's say it's the 13th. So the Gemara answers, Shushan, they have to be like Shushan. The Shushan is the 15th. Meaning, again, we don't know when the walled cities is. Maybe the walled cities do a day earlier. Let's see what Rashi says. We have to go back to that Rashi. That maybe, for whatever reason, the walled cities would do on the 13th. The unwalled cities would do on the 14th. And Shushan would do on the 15th. The Gemara is only like Shushan. Because the Torah clearly does not say, the Megillah does not say, when do the walled cities do? And we find that Shushan did on the 15th. Means to say, when it says the 14th, 15th, it means the 15th is not only for Shushan, but for Shushan and all the walled cities. Okay, so here the Gemara finishes off, basically bringing the case. Imagine, if you open the Megillah, we wouldn't even know this is such a question, because the Megillah seems to flow, right? The Megillah says, therefore, there's the 14th, there's the 15th, there's the walled cities, there's the unwalled cities. It seems to be simple that the walled cities does on the 15th. But the Gemara doesn't take it for granted. Yes, the Megillah says celebrating the 15th, but who says the Megillah is talking about walled cities? Maybe the walled cities has another date. And therefore, we have to build the whole case, Bizmanem, that it has to be like Shushan, there's no reason to add another day. So now we've already come clear that there's a difference between the walled cities and unwalled cities, that the walled cities read on the 15th, like Shushan did on the 15th, because they rested on the 15th, and any other, and walled city, and unwalled cities do it on the 14th. Yeah, okay, you have to remember, Shushan, we don't even know if Shushan was a walled city in the time of Joshua. We don't even know if Jerusalem was definitely not a walled city in the times of the story of Purim. But the conclusion of it is the halacha today is that, again, Shushan till today celebrates, if you're in the city of Shushan, they celebrate on the 15th. And in Eretz Yisrael, walled cities that we know for sure were walled in the days of Yeshua ben Nun, they celebrate on the 15th. Today, I think those are the cities of Yerushalayim, if I'm not mistaken, Haifa, possibly Tzfas, I think, and possibly Tiberias is, I think, questionable. Let's just do one more line here. Just get into the next piece of the Gemara. The Gemara says, Eshkachan Asiya. We know when we're supposed to do this. We have found the source of observing the holiday of Purim on the 14th of Adar in unwalled cities, and on the 15th in the cities and walled cities. From where do we know that the remembering Zechira Minalan? How do we know that remembering the story of Purim through the reading of the Megillah takes place on these days? It means to do it, which is the meal and the celebration. It says, the pasuk says to do. But how do we know about reading the Megillah? Maybe the Megillah is always read on the 14th in everywhere. And then the meals are done on the 15th. The pasuk says that these days are niskarim v'nasim. They're remembered and done. So just like we know clearly, because again, the verses, if you look again in the verses, it says Al-Kain, what's the pasuk say? Al-Kain ha-Yehudim ha-Prazim ha-Yoshim ba'ari ha-Prazis oisim. The word says to do. Doing means the celebration. How do we know that it also includes the reading of the Megillah, which is called the Zechira, to remember? So we say, because the pasuk says Hayam ma'el niskarim v'nasim. They're remembered and done. So whenever they're done, they're remembered. And they're done on the 15th in the walled city, so they're remembered on the 15th. They're meaning they're remembered with the reading of the Megillah on the 15th. Okay, let's just do Rashi and we'll finish the class. We clearly see, we've built the case to celebrate the joy of Purim, which means the meals, and the Mashalach Manas on the 14th for the unwalled cities, and the walled cities on the 15th. But Zechira, which means the reading of the Megillah, maybe the reading of the Megillah is always on the 14th, and just the meals are done on different days. It only says that they do the meal. The asiyah, when it says doing, means the celebration. How do we know that we read the Megillah in separate days? So iskash tchil asiyah, because the pasuk says ayam niskarim v'nasim. Whenever you do, you remember. Whenever you remember, you do. Therefore, there's only one time. Okay, this is where we stop over here. And next class, we're going to continue. We're not going to go back because we finished the subject, and we continue about that. Not everyone agrees of what it defines a walled city. Is it the times of Joshua, or maybe it's the times of the story of Purim? All right, Laila Tov, everyone. Good Yom Tov again for you to Kislev, and have Hashem see you all next week. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Welcome.